Hi. In this video, I'll take a look at a few tips and ideas to help you get more out of your synth. I'll be showing them on the Moog Subsequent 37, but many of them are applicable to other synths in one way or another, so hopefully you'll find this useful even if you have a different synth. All the examples I'll walk through here will be available for download on my Patreon. More of this music at the end of this video. Let's get started. So let's jump right in. The Subsequent 37 or Sub 37, both of which I'll just call Sub 37 from now on, are great analog synths, but in case you were feeling jealous of features in certain digital synths like sample playback or wavetable synthesis, it's quite easy to make this feel like it also has a built-in digital oscillator using an external synth or iPad where you can play that instrument using the keyboard and even control its parameters using the onboard controls. In this case, I'll be using an iPad Air 2 from 8 years ago, way back before Apple had the courage to take out the headphone jack. I'll be using a USB MIDI interface connected to a camera connection kit into the MIDI in and out of the Sub 37, and in this case a $20 wavetable synth from Waldorf called Nave. Now you're probably familiar with the external input feature on many analog and some digital synths. It's pretty straightforward. You connect audio from an external source into the external audio input, but if you also connect the MIDI output to the MIDI input of that synth, you can play that synth using the internal keyboard and then just control its level as if it was an internal oscillator. Now where it becomes more interesting is if your synth sends out MIDI CCs when you turn its parameters. Most digital synths and some analog synths do this as well. You can then map knobs you don't use on the panel to control parameters in a software synth. To map CCs in the case of Nave, you press this and then just hold the control, and then you can map any of the knobs to control this parameter. In this case, I won't be using glide in this preset, so if I just turn this knob, I've now mapped the wavetable position to this knob, and hopefully you can see it move as I turn this knob. So in this case, I can control wavetable position just by turning the glide knob. Now, not only do all the knobs send MIDI CCs or double byte CCs, which you can configure in the menu, the switches do as well, as do the knobs that have a secondary function. So for example, the 4 envelope generator knobs have the main function, attack, decay, sustain, release, but they also have a secondary function when you hold this button. So if you weren't planning to use, say, the filter envelope in your patch, you've got 8 control knobs, 4 when they're not shifted, and 4 additional ones in this sort of shift mode. So let's maybe map one more parameter. I'll go for this one. Typically, I'll use the attack and decay with the filter envelope and have sustain set down to 0, so the release knob is up for grabs. And now I'm controlling this parameter with the release knob. And just for kicks, let's do one more. Let's say map this one, and I'll do that to the shift function of the release knob. So now the shifted release knob controls brilliance, and the unshifted one controls the spectrum. Once you've done your mapping, you can just tuck the iPad away or keep it around. But regardless, you'll be controlling all its parameters from the onboard controls. You can bring in the other oscillators, of course. Okay, let's move on and talk about the pitch bend wheel for a bit. Now, you may associate the pitch bend wheel with something that you just do things like that with, which is cool, but there are a few other things you can do with it. For example, you could set pitch bend targets both for the upward motion and for the downward motion. So let's say keep the upward motion at 2 semitones for now, but set the downward motion to -12. And you can do that, by the way, using this knob. You don't need to cursor around and click. Anyway, let's go to -12. So now we still have that guitar style pitch bend. But if you want a quick octave transpose, if we've reached the edge of our range, we can do that. And you can go all the way to set it to a 2-octave transpose as well. You could, of course, always use the keyboard up and down keys, but if you need a temporary transpose, this works very nicely. Another neat thing you could do with this is set it to go just to one of the oscillators rather than both. So let's set it to only affect oscillator 2. Now this opens this up for a bunch of cool performance effects. Let's go back to the bent up range. So instinctively you could set it to, let's say, 7 semitones, which is a fifth above. So that could be used for a really nice pitch bend. Yeah, there are obviously a bunch of other intervals you could explore. A minor third or major third, 4 semitones up. You can also use the pitch bend wheel set to, say, a 12 semitone interval to break through the limitation of the 7 semitone tuning knob for oscillator 2. By the way, an octave or two of pitch bend work very nicely with hard sync. So the pitch bend wheel can be a great creative sound design tool alongside the mod wheel, of course. Okay, let's move on. The next tip or bit of advice is to know and embrace your synth's mod matrix, or mod buses in this case, which means typically modulation sources, controllers for those modulation sources, and modulation destinations. Now I have to admit, this can be intimidating at times. First time I had a look at the mod destination list for the Sub 37, I immediately shut the manual and went into the fetal position around the filter cutoff knob. But as you'll see in a bit, there are quite a few hidden gems in here, so it is worth a second look. Let's just start with the basics just to make sure everyone is caught up on what modulation is. I can change parameters manually or have something change them for me. So for example, I could use an LFO, say in a triangle, using a triangle waveform to modulate the filter. If your modulator is an LFO, you can change its frequency or rate. Both mod buses in the Sub 37 have direct connections to the oscillator pitch and filter amount, but they also have one additional assignable destination. There are quick links here on the panel to 7 different things, and you can always hold the destination button and choose a different parameter. Let's choose, say, the multi-drive, and I'll cancel this out so we just hear the modulation to the multi-drive as I increase the mod amount. What we're hearing now is modulation of the multi-drive, and modulation depth, or mod amount here, lets you set how far or how deep that motion goes. I think almost all the panel parameters are assignable this way, as well as additional hidden parameters that you don't see on the panel. Dozens of targets. Now these are called mod buses and not LFOs because aside from the LFOs with their bunch of different shapes, you can also choose a programmable source, either the filter envelope or any one of a number of other sources. Now this isn't going to be a Sub 37 tutorial, but it's just worthwhile having a look at this in your synth. These are the program sources that you can choose from. Again, you can use this knob in this case. So not that many here, but if we look at the program destinations, there are over 80 to choose from. That's that list we saw before. Let's set this one back to drive. Another important thing you should know about a mod matrix or the mod buses here or in every synth is that they will typically have controllers, things that can limit the modulation. So let's go back to the LFO as the mod source. Notice that we didn't hear anything until I moved the mod wheel. That's because by default, the mod wheel is a controller for modulation on mod bus 1. There are a few control options here: the velocity, aftertouch, and yet another little menu, assignable control amount 4, which can be any one of these parameters. So breath controller, filter envelope, and so on. So a few more controllers or attenuators for any mod source that you pick here. So for example here, since I introduced the filter envelope as a controller for both the mod wheel and the LFO, having the mod wheel up isn't enough to hear the modulation, which brings us to our next tip, which is important to know. If you want to have an LFO fade in and your synth doesn't have an LFO fade in parameter, like the sub 37 doesn't, you can use one of the envelopes to fade in the LFO. So as I bring the filter envelope attack up, I can now have the LFO gradually come in and fade out if I wanted to with decay. If I didn't want it to fade out, I could increase sustain. So a controller can either be a physical control or a modulation source that will impact the main mod source in a mod bus. Another little mod matrix trick, if I just wanted to assign the mod wheel to a parameter without having the LFO make it wobble, one of the sources you may find in your mod matrix, and if we go into here and mod matrix edit, I could choose constant on, which basically makes this into a constant voltage or value, and then I could control any parameter I wanted, in this case the drive, with the mod wheel. Now it obviously doesn't make sense to assign this to a knob I can just access on the panel, unless I wanted to have close control of it here, but it does for one of the hidden parameters, meaning a parameter that doesn't have a dedicated knob on the panel, or say if I wanted to control two parameters. Now unfortunately the mod matrix on the sub 37 doesn't let you send one source to two destinations, but just for fun, a little idea that I had earlier, if I want to cancel out the gain drop, basically enable gain compensation for when you increase resonance, right? So one of the characteristics of a ladder filter is that as you bring in resonance, you lose bass. So if I wanted to have automatic gain compensation, I could use Modbus 2 to do that. Let's go ahead and enter its controllers and go into edit and choose the source here again, constant on. For a destination, I want to pick resonance. I could go into the menu here and look for it, but I could just assign it like this to filter resonance. And I want to go back and set the mod wheel here to maximum intensity. Mod 1 controlling multi-drive, mod 2 controlling resonance, and everything coming in from the mod wheel. By the way, the middle position on the mod wheel means 0, so that's no modulation. Anyway, these need to be set to taste, including the mod depths, but if we set it just right, you can see now I'm increasing resonance without bass taking a hit. Obviously, we're changing the timbre. We could apply this potentially to level as well. By the way, in the specific example of these two knobs, just because they're close, an easier way would be to take a rubber band and tie it to both. And now they move together as well. Or you could invert the rubber band to get inverse modulation. If you've got multiple parameters that aren't a rubber band's length away, you could control them from a central location. All right, let's move on. More Modbus ideas in a bit, but before that, next tip, if your synth has an associated plugin or control software, whether by the manufacturer or by a third party, spend time getting familiar with it. No one buys a hardware synth just to use a plugin, but taking a look at it is a great way to get familiar with features that may be hidden or hard to access on the panel, kind of like a different view into something. Case in point, the sub or subsequent 37 has dozens of hands-on controls on the panel, but it also has quite a few additional controls, either in the preset menu, or in the global menu, or in the MIDI menu, or in the controllers menus. Not to mention the sequencer. The plugin gives you a great overall view into a lot of these. So for example, if you want to choose a mod source or a mod destination, it's much easier to do that using the control software, especially when you have a long parameter list. Also, there are a few other controls that I never knew existed until I saw this. For example, the attack slope. It's a great way to get a bird's eye view of all the controllers. And like I mentioned earlier, it's way easier to control the sequencer using the screen. I mean, programming a sequence isn't a big deal. So that's pretty simple, obviously. But when you get into editing ratchets or even rest or ties, it's just easier to see things here. mod depth on a per step basis, or any of these parameters. Again, there's access to all of these in the menus. It's just way easier to see them like this. Now, aside from a better overall view into hidden synth parameters, another benefit of using the plugin is to break free from the limits of the onboard sequencer altogether, both in terms of pattern length and in terms of automation. So pattern length is obvious. You can make sequences as long as you like in your DAW, but beyond that, your DAW will let you make as many automation lanes as you like, not just one like here. You can record these automations either by turning knobs on the panel or turning virtual knobs on the plugin. So for example, if I hit record here, and whether I have a sequence going or not, let's say if I move the filter cutoff, you can see the automation register over here. I'll turn on automation so we can actually see that. I can also edit that using the control on the panel. And if I wanted, I could obviously overlay additional automation to this. So let's say filter resonance, and again, change that here. And now I've got 2 automation lanes. And like I mentioned, you can have as many of these as you want. Okay, so before we head out, let's take a look at a few other interesting mod destinations. I'll just start with an init preset here. And I do have some reverb here. Anyway, one of the interesting things about the Subsequent 37 is that the switches are also fair game for modulation. So for example, I could choose to set a mod destination, let's say for mod 1, to have that control the octave of, say, LFO 1 here. Let's start maybe with a triangle LFO and choose a mod depth. Right, so this modulation is the LFO switching around the octave of oscillator 1. Another switch type control that could be interesting to modulate is the slope of the filter. This can get a bit clicky, but again, the point is that switches are up for grabs as mod destinations too. Let's take a look at a couple more interesting destinations. I've gone ahead and created a preset where the LFO modulates the arpeggiator rate. I'll set this to 0 to begin with. And as I increase the mod depth, the arpeggiator rate will oscillate between 2 values because I'm modulating it with a square LFO, and this can produce some interesting rhythmic results as well. Certainly worth experimenting with, I think. Same goes for ratchet count in the sequencer. It's also fair game for modulation. So I've got LFO 1 controlling the number of ratchets in the sequence. Again, interesting rhythmic possibilities there. And the last little slightly hidden feature that I wanted to show you is that you can use the sequencer as a custom LFO. So if you hit the mod only button, then obviously add mod depth and choose a mod destination. Let's go for filter drive and then set some values in here. We can even make a longer sequence, obviously. Then we can now modulate filter drive in this case. It would have been nice if they added smoothing here, but if you want a multi-step custom LFO, you've got it here. So that's it for now. If you enjoyed the tips and ideas in this video, there are plenty more where they came from in my ever-expanding book, available to the good people who support this channel on Patreon. Hit like if this was useful, ring the bell after subscribing to make sure you don't miss the next one. Thanks for watching.